I know many of you enjoy taking photographs, and there are probably more people taking more photographs now than at any other time in history. But do you have any idea how important your photographs may be to that history? Hi, I'm Gary Coover, and this is a recreation of a presentation I did on October 23rd, 2023 to the Eyes of Hawaii Photography Club in Honolulu, all about Chinatown in Honolulu and of early photographers who documented those buildings, as well as photographers throughout the years who have documented the history of the buildings and the people of Honolulu's Chinatown. And I hope you enjoy this trip through history as we look at how photography has really helped those of us who do historical research learn more about the people and places that we care about. There are many different sources for doing historical research, but in this case I found that fire insurance maps, photographs, and newspaper stories were the ideal combination for putting the puzzle pieces together. The maps show where things were, but they are only two-dimensional, and what you see is just a little rectangle or a little square. You really don't know what it looked like. You just kind of know where it was, and at least the fire insurance maps put out by Dakin and by Sanborn and by Lyon will tell you a little bit about the construction, but not much else. So that's two-dimensional. Now the photographers went out there, caught pictures of these early buildings. That adds that all-important third dimension. Now you see these buildings have windows, doors, they've got lanais and porches and all sorts of interesting architectural features that you do not see at all in the two-dimensional maps. And then once you look at newspapers, now you're adding the all-important fourth dimension of time. You know, where things were, when things happened, and it's an excellent way to find out even more about the subject of the photograph. You find names, you find dates, you find builders, you find the people who lived and worked there, you find the stories that happened at those places. So by combining these three different sources, you're able to put together a really lively picture and recreate what life was like in this particular place and time at a particular time. And that's what we'll be looking at this evening. We'll be going through several of the early buildings in Chinatown, and we'll be looking at early photographs, maybe some current photographs, and there'll be a few surprises, I'm sure, along the way that people have not realized what was where, when. We'll start off by looking at some of the early photographers that worked in the Honolulu area. This particular photograph is a 1927 Fulmer Graflex 8x10 camera, known as a 10A Century Studio camera. And this is sort of a more modern version of what a lot of the early photographers, late 1800s, early 1900s, carried around. Large 8x10 format cameras, printed big giant glass slides, many of which are luckily at the State Archives today. Many have been digitized, and we can see them today in all their incredible detail. And we'll start off talking about someone who's not actually a photographer, but pretty darn close. Yeah, I know this isn't a photograph, but Paul Emmert was an artist was born in Bern, Switzerland in 1826, came to New York City about 1845, went to the California Gold Rush via Peru and Panama, and he was famous for painting many panoramas. These were giant, long scrolls of images that were almost like a wind-up scroll on either side, and that somebody would explain what's going by as the picture was going by, kind of like an early version of a motion picture. And he put together a huge one of the California Gold Rush that toured the East Coast several places to great acclaim. And he also did one later that was said to be almost a mile in length. Well, in 1853, right in the middle of a smallpox epidemic, he came to Honolulu and started sketching buildings in Honolulu. And he printed 6 panels like the one you see here, of buildings around the edge and then panoramas in the middle. 6 different views he published in 1854. 1855, he did a panorama of King Kamehameha III's funeral procession that was 29 feet long. Later moved to Kona and then passed away in Honolulu in 1867. But the amazing thing about Paul Emmert is, even though technically these are sketches, they are very photorealistic sketches. Take, for example, his sketch of the Market House, which was built in 1850 at the, let's see, if you're driving down Nuuanu Street towards the harbor and you turn left onto Nimitz, you are then driving right through where this building used to be located. It was on the site of a native market that had been there for several years, but this was the brand new Market House, and it was only about 3 or 4 years old when Emmert sketched it. And it was there until 1899, and in that year, this is what it looked like. So as you can see, Emmert's drawing is not just a standard freehand drawing. It is a very, very accurate representation of the building. Now, the building by 1899, the arched doorways had been filled in, and a few other little changes made in the ensuing almost 50 years, but you get a sense of how accurate Emmert's sketches actually were. Of the nearly 100 buildings sketched by Paul Emmert in Honolulu between 1853 and 1854, here are 4 of them that were in Chinatown. At the upper left is the store of Francis Spencer. He dealt in very, very fancy goods from Europe, and his store was located as early as 1850 on Hotel Street, where the Swing Club is today. On the upper right was the very, very fancy home of Henry Skinner, very wealthy English businessman. This was referred to as one of the most pretentious homes in Honolulu at the time, built of coral, stone blocks, 2 stories high, verandas all around. That is now the site of Mark's Garage at Nuuanu and Pauahi. On the lower left is the store and shop of Charlie Vincent. He was the premier builder in Honolulu in the 1850s and 60s. And this was located where the CQ Yehop Plaza building is today at King Street and Mauna Kea. And in the lower right was a house, kind of a rambling collection of rooms put together in a house for Dr. Wesley Newcomb, who named his compound there Hopewell Place. And that was located at the corner of Smith and Beretania, across the street from what was the Kamakapili Church at the time. Now, I don't have any proof, but I'd be very, very surprised if Emmert didn't utilize one of the very common drawing aids of his day, which was a type of camera. It was called a camera lucida, and it was very popular in the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s. This particular one here comes from about that same time period. And it's essentially a prism on a stick. I think it explains the incredible accuracy of Emmert's sketches, because when you compare them with the photographs, they're absolutely spot on. And then what this did was it projected an image onto a piece of paper in the same way an SLR camera works today, except in this case, you have to draw it yourself. The image is projected onto paper. So I'd say I can't prove it, but I suspect that a lot of Emmert's sketches were done with the assistance of a camera lucida, which would explain their incredible accuracy. Although there had been a few traveling photographers in the early days that came through Honolulu, probably the very first one that came and stayed was Hugo Stangenwald. He was born in Dresden, Germany, and had studied medicine and surgery in Vienna. And like many people, he went to California for the gold rush and came to Hawaii in 1853 on his way to Sydney, Australia, along with Stephen Goodfellow, and they were making daguerreotypes, which was a very early type of printing onto a metal plate. Could not reproduce, make additional copies unless you got another metal plate and just repose the entire photograph. In 1858, he sold his business, returned to Vienna to complete his medical studies, and came back to Honolulu. But from that point on, was a doctor, and he sold off his photography practice. Henry L. Chase was probably the most prolific of the very early photographers. He was born in Burlington, New Hampshire in 1831, and he came to Honolulu from Boston. And his first ad ran in 1859. In 1862, he purchased the Joseph King photography business, which was next to the post office. And in 1866, he purchased the portrait negatives of Charles Weed. And in 1870, he moved upstairs to a building at the corner of Fort and Hotel. And that's the building we see here in this picture. And an interesting thing about this photograph is that's the skylight he built on top of the building. Most photography studios can be spotted in the early days by the skylights. Henry Chase was the first photographer in Honolulu to take panoramic photographs of the growing city. This particular photograph was taken in 1870. We have here the store of Archibald Cleghorn, which had been built just about a year or so before. This is the building that Chase moved into in 1870 and later added the skylight on it. This was the first store here of Heinrich Hackfeld, a German businessman and captain who lived in this house back here, and his business later became known as AmFac, one of the big 5 companies in Honolulu. We have back here the post office on Merchant Street under construction, so we know for sure this is 1870. We have here the International Hotel, the Bethel Chapel, and over here the very first known photograph of the Robinson Building, which we'll be talking about a little bit more later on. Now the interesting thing is where Chase took this photograph from. This was the vantage point that Chase used to take his panoramic photos. This is the fire alarm bell tower that was built around March of 1870. So Chase would have lugged his 8x10 camera and equipment and glass negative slides all the way up to the top of this tower, and he took several shots in all directions. And this particular tower is located on Union Street, which is now Union Pedestrian Mall, and in the front we can see a little bit of Hotel Street. Another famous photographer, he didn't ever really live in Honolulu, but he did some very important work here, was Isaiah Tabor. He was born in New Bedford, Massachusetts in 1830, had been a whaler, went to the California Gold Rush like many people did back in those days, and ended up opening up a studio in San Francisco. And in 1880, he came on a 6-week tour of Hawaii and took photographs all over the islands and quite a few of the buildings in downtown Honolulu. And for many buildings, that's the absolute first photograph we have. He came back in 1883 for the coronation of King Kalakaua. And unfortunately, in 1906, an earthquake, the earthquake in San Francisco, destroyed 80 tons of his portrait negatives and 20 tons of his view negatives. So we're very lucky that several of his photographs of Honolulu have survived. This picture here, this is Merchant Street. And if you notice, the building in the middle is the 1871 post office building, which is still there today. On the left was the Sailor's Home, and on the right was the very first Honolulu Holly, which is the government house. And this is a view that Tabor took of Nuuanu Street. He's standing just about the middle of Hotel Street looking up Nuuanu, and this was taken in 1880. Born in England in 1854, James Williams, J.J. Williams, or Jimmy Williams, as he was often known, was active in Honolulu from 1882 to 1926, over 40 years. In 1882, he purchased the Menzies-Dixon business, and in 1888, he founded the Paradise of the Pacific magazine. And in 1891, he moved into the new building there in the photograph where he had the entire top floor. That was on Fort Street. That is where the Executive Center is today. The Ross for Less store now occupies that footprint. And unfortunately, Jimmy Williams was killed by a streetcar in 1926 at age 72. He just walked right into it, right at the corner of Fort and Hotel. Gabriel Bertram Bellinghausen was born in Germany around 1849, came to Honolulu in 1883 as the director of St. Louis College for 22 years. But he was also a very avid amateur photographer and spent many years, probably 1883, 1905, photographing buildings, in particular churches and things in the Honolulu area. Of course, a lot of shots of St. Louis College. Better known as Brother Bertram. very famous collection of photographs that have survived. In 1905, he was reassigned to Dayton, Ohio, and then to San Antonio, and became head of St. Mary's College. But he left behind 800 glass plates and 2,000 photographs. And the photograph you see here is the Catholic Church. That's the second steeple that was on the church. Paul Emmert had used the first steeple as his vantage point for his panoramas, the sketches all around Honolulu. And if you look on the right side of the photo, you see a tree in the background. That is the very first kiawe tree that came to Honolulu. And every kiawe tree, which is all over the Hawaiian Islands, that was the very first one right there. Frank Davy was born in London in 1860, and he worked with Henry van der Weydt of London, Wallery of Paris, with Napoleon Cerrone in New York, and from 1886 to 1896, he was the manager and chief operator of the Tabor Photographic Gallery in San Francisco. And in 1896, he came to Honolulu, and he opened an office on the top floor of the Mott Smith building. He was the inventor of what he called the iridium process. And he left Honolulu in 1906 and moved to San Francisco just in time for the earthquake, and then later had a studio in Palo Alto. So he was only active in Honolulu from 1896 to 1906. And this is the Mott Smith building, where he had his studio on the third floor. The building started off in 1885 as a two-story building, and over the years it got remodeled, I don't know how many times, 5, 6, 7 times. The building has gone through more changes than probably any building in downtown Honolulu. It's at the corner of Fort and Hotel, and I bet many people don't recognize this building today, but it is still there, and it looks like this. Yep, the third floor was Frank Davy's photography studio. Robert Bonine was originally from Altoona, Pennsylvania, born there in 1861. He was known as the father of motion pictures in Hawaii. He took the first stereo images of the Johnstown flood in 1889, and 1890s he worked with Gaumont in France, and in 1889 he joined up with Thomas Edison in New Jersey, and he filmed kinetograph camera images of the Klondike Gold Rush for Edison, the first one to take moving pictures of geysers in Yellowstone. And in 1901, he came to Hawaii on his way to China because he was making films for Biograph about the Boxer Rebellion. He filmed the San Francisco earthquake in 1906, and then he came to Hawaii with 20,000 feet of film for Edison, and he recorded events all over the island. So it was the first one to take moving pictures of people harvesting sugarcane, of people surfing, and he also, lucky for us, took pictures of downtown Honolulu buildings. Now this is a view down King Street. This is from Bethel Street looking Eva. Let's see if I can point out some of the buildings in the distance. This is the Robinson building we'll talk about later. Let's see, this building is still here today. This was the original Castle and Cook building. Well, the interesting thing is this photograph was taken on Friday, August 3rd, 1906, shortly after 10 o'clock in the morning. And wouldn't it be great if we could actually put this picture in motion? Well, we can, because what Bonine did was he organized a streetcar, and he mounted his camera on the front of a streetcar and went down King Street. And this is what King Street looked like on Friday, August 3rd, 1906. This is Nuuanu Street here with the carriage and the wagon going across. Smith Street was right here, but it didn't go all the way through yet. And we're coming up on the intersection with Mauna Kea Street, where the man's running across there and the kid running across. Coming up on the Oahu Market, which is on the left side here. fantastic historic record, the first ever moving pictures of in downtown Honolulu by Robert Bonin. And there have been many other photographers in Hawaii since. Ray Jerome Baker in particular stands out. But for Chinatown, really the most important photographer we'll talk about next is Nancy Bannock. She was born in Iowa in 1926, came to Hawaii in 1948 from Stanford University, and from 1952 to 1974, she was the Hawaii editor of Sunset Magazine, and she became an absolutely tireless proponent of Chinatown buildings. This was during the urban renewal craze, I guess you could call it, of the 1960s, where there was a lot of money for slum clearances, and so any old building had to be torn down and cleared out. And at one point, just about all of Chinatown was in the target hairs of the urban renewal people. And she started photographing buildings all over Chinatown, trying to save them, trying to build up some interest. She was very instrumental in creating the Historic Building Task Force with just a huge crowd of volunteers. They went to buildings all over Honolulu and they documented with photographs, they took notes, they had a checklist. They went through and tried to at least document what was there before it may be turned down. And really through Nancy Bannock's efforts, the Historic Preservation Ordinance was created in 1973 for the Chinatown Historic District, and that has been what really basically saved Chinatown. Nancy Bannock is probably the great savior of Honolulu's Chinatown. So when we talk about Chinatown, some people may not know exactly where it is. It's basically located between Beretania Street and the Honolulu Harbor, which was Queen Street, now known as Nimitz Highway. On the left is River Street and Nuuanu Stream, and on the right is Nuuanu Street. And everything in the middle was Chinatown. It wasn't originally called Chinatown because the very first Chinese that came to Honolulu were just on some of these ships in the late 1700s. And it wasn't until 1852 that the first ship of Chinese workers came in to Honolulu. Before that, there were several Chinese businessmen. They had businesses in town, but this wasn't the area where a lot of the Chinese lived. And this is where many of them chose to settle. This was the working man's part of town. It's near the harbor. Housing was cheap. There were lots of bars because it was near the ships. A lot of things going on in Chinatown. Here's a view of a couple of photographers taken of some of the Chinese on board ship coming to town, as well as some photographs of Chinese taken here in Honolulu. The gentleman at the very bottom was Chun Fong, the very first Chinese millionaire in Honolulu, and he was in the Robinson Building, which we'll talk about here in just a little bit. Now, when you have a culture that values money and values luck, you're going to have gambling, and there was a lot of gambling in Chinatown. These were the main games: Pai Gow, Fantan, Chifa, Pakapio, and there were flagpoles that would announce the results. There were runners going around carrying information back and forth. People say you could hear the clicking of dominoes upstairs. It was very, very big business in the Chinatown area. As was the smoking of opium. It was considered really to be a cultural necessity for the Chinese. The haoles, or the white people in Honolulu, were forbidden to partake, but it was considered important for the Chinese, and so there were opium dens. Now, these weren't down in dark tunnels and basements and stuff like that. These were mostly up on the second floor of the buildings. Most of the buildings in Chinatown were 2 stories tall, wood construction, large blocks. So it's the interior of the blocks where a lot of the housing was, and inside the housing was where a lot of the gambling took place, a lot of the opium, the prostitution, and all that sort of good stuff that comes along with being in a working man's area near the harbor. So in 1855, they had a police station on King Street between Smith and Nuuanu Street, and they replaced it in 1879 because they said we needed a new, larger station house due to the increase in evil doing in our midst. So this was right there in Chinatown, and this particular photograph was taken on April 18th, 1886, at just right about noon or so. And the amazing thing about this photograph is that 6 hours later, this building was burned completely to the ground. Nobody in this photograph had any clue that was about to happen. But there were some gamblers above a restaurant at the corner of Hotel and Smith Street, or Smith's Lane it was called then, and they didn't like the way the results had gone. They threw the papers into a fire. A scuffle ensued. The fire got spread around the room, and before they knew it, over 20 acres of Chinatown was burned and almost reached to downtown Honolulu. It almost destroyed the whole town. And photographers, of course, were quick to take pictures of the ruins. What we have in the upper right corner, taken from the Robinson Building, that's the United Chinese, or what's left, the United Chinese Society Building. You see Kamakapili Church in the background and pretty much nothing in between. Down below is a view down King Street, kind of from Nuuanu, looking towards the Eva direction. This photograph is where you're looking at what would have been Isaac Montgomery's house on the left. It was a kanji factory by this point, and was at one point the residence of a gentleman named Herman Melville, believe it or not. In the background, the ruins of the Liberty Hall, which is a very popular drinking, dancing, bowling establishment at Mauna Kea. That is where the Wolfat building sits today. And here's a picture that was sold by J.J. Williams, obviously is a souvenir, I guess, of the fire. And this is from King Street looking up Nuuanu. Once again, you see the church with the two steeples in the background and the ruins of the Aswan building right in the middle. And this photograph is standing at the intersection of King and Nuuanu, looking Eva. We have the Robinson Building on the left, and we have the ruins of the United Chinese Society kind of in the haze in the background. So there was, of course, a big push to come back with fireproof buildings, and not everyone could afford to do that. And although they wanted everything to River Street to be fireproof, they couldn't do that. So they created a fire limit line that kind of zigged and zagged along, kind of along Mauna Kea, Smith, up towards Beretania. And the building at top was the very first building built after the fire, built in 1886. It was built in 6 weeks and a day by builder George Lucas, for it's the Cosmopolitan Saloon. At the bottom of the picture is the new Aswan building. Aswan was a very prominent businessman in Honolulu, as well as probably the preeminent opium smoker in town. He was raided many times, and he was also an expert witness on the quality of opium, so he was on both sides of the law. And this was built by E.B. Ted Thomas, who built in 1886. Thomas also was the builder of the Iolani Palace. Now, some of the other buildings were quite substantial that came up in Chinatown. In particular, a very unusual, very unique style called Eastlake Victorian. Architect Isaac Palmer, originally born in Ohio, educated in Wisconsin, built some buildings in Seattle, came to Honolulu in 1887 and was only here for, oh gosh, probably 5-6 years, but built at least a dozen buildings in Honolulu. And he was a huge proponent of Queen Anne and Eastlake styles, and these are the 3 finest buildings of his that still survive, and these are kind of about the 3 of the best examples of Eastlake Victorian architecture you'll find anywhere. Classic characteristics of Eastlake Victorian is these sort of vertical bays, very much inspired by Eastlake furniture. And if you've seen them at auction or in museums, they have these vertical sort of pilasters ever so often, and then you have these incised medallions. That's a very distinctive characteristic of Eastlake Victorian. And this is the Perry Block at Nuuanu Hotel, the T.R. Foster Building, which is 1891 at Merchant and Nuuanu, and then the little right-hand corner is the Royal Saloon, now known as Murphy's Bar and Grill, and that was built in 1890. And these were all designed by Isaac Palmer. But then again, about half of Chinatown looked just like this. These were the new buildings that came in, very typical style. And if you think about it, this looks an awful lot the way Lahaina used to look. Two-story wooden buildings, narrow streets, overhanging balconies, very fire-prone, unfortunately, and very sad to see what happened in Lahaina. And it's very similar. The photographs of Lahaina are very similar to what happened in the fires in Chinatown. Now, in late 1899, people started noticing that rats were dying around the harbor in large numbers. They weren't really quite sure what was going on, but bubonic plague had been sweeping through the Pacific bit by bit, and by late 1899, it was in Honolulu. And so the Board of Health was given extraordinary powers. They basically took over the government. And what they decided to do was, if someone had contracted bubonic plague and it was a wooden building, they were going to burn the building to the ground. And the very first fire was at the corner of Pauahi and Nuuanu. In fact, Pauahi did not go through to Bethel at that time. And this is the buildings on fire on the lower right, and on the left is the crowd of people watching that very fire. And these photographs were caught by Frank Davey. And one of the things that they did was they had the photographers documenting the fires, the burning, for insurance purposes, and also just to make sure that everything was done according to the law and the plan. The second fire, January 1st, 1900. The last one was December 31st. This is January 1st. This is a building at the corner of Mauna Kea and Pauahi. And you can see they're training water on the adjoining building so it doesn't burn, but then they're trying to burn out the building and hopefully get rid of the plague vermin. And the interesting thing is they took pictures of every wooden building in Chinatown, and those are now down at the Hawaii State Archives. And these are what a lot of the buildings looked like in Chinatown. At the upper left was the first Kobayashi Hotel. That was on Smith Street. On the right is the Beehive Saloon, very popular drinking establishment. The lower left was the Hop Sing store. That's the corner of Beretania and Nuuanu. And on the right is a Chinese photography studio. For those of you who can read Chinese, it says something to the effect of cheap photographs. Now, one of the really interesting things about these photographs that they took of Chinatown was people often posed. When there's a camera, they wanted to pose and have their picture taken too. So if you zoom in on some of these photographs, you get an amazing look at the people of Honolulu in January 1900. And these are just amazing. It's just amazing what you can find in the details when you zoom in on some of these pictures. Like the young Japanese boy there on the lower left, you can notice his shoes, traditional Japanese wooden shoes. At the very bottom, the man and his wife and all his little kids all lined up. And I just love that little girl in the lower right corner kind of peeking around one of the poles. Well, on January 20th, 1900, there had been 8 different fires in Chinatown where they had burned various buildings or even entire blocks. And on January 20th, they started a fire back behind the Kamakapili Church, and the wind changed. And all of a sudden, it was blowing sparks and embers every which way. The firemen tried to control it. The wind just got stronger and stronger. The steeple of the church, one of the steeples of the church caught on fire, and they couldn't reach it. And it acted like a sparkler, and it showered sparks all over, basically all over the part of Chinatown that hadn't been burned already by the Board of Health. And Brother Bertram at St. Louis College had his camera set up, and he caught photographs of Chinatown as it burned. And so here's an early picture. This is early in the morning of January 20th, 1900. Here's that exact same scene just a few hours later. And here's that exact same scene again with just what is left. So this rather crude graphic shows in orange these sites that were burned by the Board of Health, and then the the big out-of-control fire on January 20th in 1900. So there were 9 fires in Chinatown, but the one everyone really remembers is the big one in 1900. Now, here's a photograph showing the fire on January 20th, 1900, as it's raging in Chinatown. And what you need to keep in mind is that Chinatown was under quarantine. There was a wooden fence all around Chinatown, and there was a gate guarded by soldiers. And it developed very quickly into a very desperate situation where you had crowds of people trying to get out of Chinatown. And now these were people, many of whom did not speak English. They had been basically fenced into a place that had bubonic plague, and now that place was on fire, an out-of-control fire. And they realized very quickly there was about to be a near riot, and so they decided they would let the people out, but they still didn't want them just getting loose in the community because they didn't trust them because of plague, etc. So they the citizens of Honolulu formed a line down King Street, and the residents of Chinatown were allowed to go to Kauai Hau Church, and that became the new quarantine facility. It must have been just an unbelievable time for these poor people that be treated like this as they went down the street. And the most amazing thing is, if you look at the photograph closely, and if you zoom in, how many axe handles do you see people holding in this photograph? They were there to make sure nobody got out of line. It had to have been absolutely humiliating for those poor people from Chinatown, having to endure all of the plague, the fire, all of that stuff, and now have people with axe handles making sure that they don't get out of line. Well, one of the big casualties of that out-of-control fire was the Kamakapili Church. This is a photograph on the left taken by Frank Davey, and inside was this absolutely gorgeous Bevington and Sons pipe organ. It cost $4,500 in 1887, and that's about $146,000 today, something like that. The test recital was by the organist from Westminster, and Queen Kapiolani was in attendance in London, and they had it shipped to Hawaii and installed in the church. And a lot of people also brought their goods to put in the church while the fire was raging, thinking the church would be a safe place. But unfortunately, the church completely burned, and this is what the church looked like after the fire. At the upper left is the Chinese fire engine house. It was the first brick fire station in Honolulu because the volunteer Chinese firemen were so good at what they did. Everyone was so proud of them. They built them a brick fire station, but it did not survive the fire. And then the church did not survive the fire. Now, one interesting thing, these were typical buildings. This is on Pauahi Street, and pretty so-so construction. But the interesting thing is that these pictures kind of hid a secret, and that secret is right there. And when these buildings were burned, they found a stone wall that nobody had any idea where it had come from, when it was built, anything like that. Well, doing a little research, it turns out this stone wall was part of old land claim back in 1848 after what they called as part of what they called the Great Mahele, which was the distribution of lands into private ownership. This was one of the lands between Joseph Booth's property and Kuakolu's property. Now, the Hawaiian word Kuakolo can also be translated to mean 5 generations. So that leads the question is, how old is this wall? Is it 5 generations old? We know for a fact it was there in 1848 because it was mentioned in the land claim. So this is probably the oldest structure in Honolulu, and it was in one of those early photographs. Well, speaking of other surprises, there's this building. I was originally going to be doing a walking tour of Chinatown for the folks with the rail project. I was approached about doing that. And I thought, that's great, find 30, 40 buildings, gather a bunch of the data, lomi it into a nice walking tour. And I have to admit, I completely omitted this building in my first draft. I thought, nothing really here to talk about. And The more I started looking into the historical information on Chinatown, there just wasn't much there, and a lot was inaccurate, a lot was missing. And then I discovered some surprises about this building. Remember the photograph we showed back in 1886 of the fire on King Street? And I thought something on the left looks kind of similar, kind of the same massing, same kind of, wait a minute. I had to hop in my car, run down to King Street. Sure enough, it was this building. So this building I knew was there in 1886. I thought, whoa, okay, we got to find out more about this. Well, it turns out this building was built by James Robinson, and it was designed by Theodor C. Heuck, early German architect who also did the Ilani Barracks. And it looked like this. In 1890, I think, was when this sketch was made. But this is what the building originally looked like. Built of coral stone blocks. Chona Fong, the Chinese millionaire, had his office and store upstairs. And the surprising thing, the building was remodeled in 1939 by Yongtong Char. But if you go to the little alleyway on the Mackay side of the building and look up, you're looking at 1864. The oldest building in Chinatown by far. Another building I hadn't paid a whole lot of attention to was what everyone calls the Lai Fong building. It's in sad shape. It's had a rough history. In fact, it had a rougher history than even I imagined, because when it was new, it looked like this. It was built in 1880. This is a Henry Chase photograph when it was the Hollister drugstore and the Gu Kim dry goods store, and it was known as the Pico Block, made for Manuel Pico from Portugal, and designed and built by S.D. Burroughs. And this building kind of sort of survived the 1886 fire. It was right on the edge, and it had iron shutters to keep the fire out. But unfortunately, the roof caught on fire. It crashed in. The insides caught on fire, and it became, as they said, a great burning cauldron within. And the very shutters that were closed to keep the fire out also kept the water out until the firemen were not able to get in to get water inside the building. But afterwards, they determined that the brick walls were still safe, and they were able to rebuild. But thanks to photography, we know what the original store looked like on the inside. This is Henry Chase's photograph of the Hollister drugstore. Okay, now this is kind of a boring photograph. It's a parking lot. It's a temporary parking lot. It was temporary 30 years ago, and still there today. And most people probably drive by it and have no idea why they should even care about this particular site. This is between Nuanu and Bethel Street, just below Beretania. But once upon this site sat what could be called a royal palace. It was the home of Dr. Rook, and it was also the home of Queen Emma. She was the Hanai, or adopted daughter of Dr. Rook, and she grew up in this house, and it was the doctor's office and library and dispensary downstairs, and very luxurious living quarters upstairs with koa wood trim and furniture and fancy paintings and carpets and all that good stuff. Well, it later became tenement housing, as a lot of grand mansions do over time. The times change, families change, people don't take care of their property, and it became Japanese tenements and was torn down shortly after 1900. Now, in 1912, they built the Ye Liberty Studio, the Ye Liberty Theater on the site. And that was a place that had all kinds of entertainment. It had trained leopards. It had Mei Lan Fan, who's claimed to be the greatest actor in China in the past 400 years. The famous English contralto Dame Clara Butt also performed at the Liberty Theater. Later on, they showed movies there instead of live shows. And let's see, it was the first place where Creature from the Black Lagoon was shown in 3D. And then later they showed kung fu movies and then Japanese porn. And then it was torn down for a parking lot, and that was it. This is an interesting building built by Yong Nin, from China, known as Young Anin. Is a form of respect for in the Cantonese language. It'd be like calling me Mr. Gary. You call someone Nin. Nin was his first name, Young was his last name, Yong Nin. He built this massive building after the 1900 fire. The center portion of this building is now gone. It was briefly a mid-century modern building with fins. You can see there in the photograph on the right. And then in the 1990s, they decided they wanted to make it look a little bit more old-timey. And so there's this rather sort of odd-looking building there in the corner now. And at the bottom, those three pictures, that's basically the three building kind of, that's the building basically put back together the way it looks today. Which once again, nobody had any idea that these two buildings on either end were part of a much larger building, but this wonderful photograph revealed that information. Once again, the importance of photographs. I just want to really stress that as we go along, that the pictures you take of buildings will mean so much to researchers in the future. And in particular, these pictures with the signs, these signs are all long gone. The buildings that on the top are both still there. If you get the light just right, you can kind of make out the T. Sumida and Company at Mauna Kea and Pauahi. Right across the street from that, it was the Hawaii Hochi newspaper building. They had these lovely big Japanese characters painted across the side of it. Lower left, Ahi Hale. Ching Ahi owned a lot of property around the corner of Nuuanu and Pauahi. And so this was his house or his place, Ahi Hale. And Mpaiki Emiloa is Hawaiian for cheap photographs. So once again, you can kind of see the skylight there. In the middle at the bottom is the Chinese photo studio again. And on the lower right is the Eskamura building. It's still there today, but it's long since lost the characters. That's on Nuuanu Street. Now, photography was a huge thing in the 1930s and 40s, in particular on Hotel Street, with all the sailors and the military in town from all over. They wanted to have their picture taken with an authentic hula girl, with Princess Papaya or Princess Papuli or whatever. And there were photo booths everywhere. There were amusement centers. They had games of chance. They had soda fountains. You name it. It was a way to keep the sailors entertained. And Hotel Street was definitely the place to go. There were also, through photographs, we learned about what was called climbing the stairs. Now, the photograph on the left is from an old family album from somebody, we don't know who. And you think, oh, these are just sailors just sort of standing around on the street. Well, they're not exactly doing that. They are standing at the New Bungalow Hotel, as it was called. Second floor of that building was a brothel, as were all of these buildings in this picture, and even more. There was a huge business in Chinatown in the 30s and 40s. It was $3 for 3 minutes. Everybody made an unbelievable amount of money. It was illegal, of course, but the police regulated. Don't you just love that? The idea being that there were all these lusty males in town. We have to protect the local women folk. So everyone kind of turned a blind eye to what was going on in Chinatown, and the fact there was so much money being made. Everybody was really happy about that. The jewelers and the people in fancy goods would come by the houses and show the women their wares and sell them stuff. The building at the top was the New Senator Hotel. That was the largest brothel in Chinatown, had 12 women working there. All these women were mainly from the U.S. mainland, oddly enough. But the New Senator Hotel was the inspiration for an Academy Award winning film, a major novel, and let's see, what else? It was, the film had Frank Sinatra, Deborah Carr, Ernest Borgnine. I mean, it was just a cast of all the top actors of their day. And in the movie, they called it the New Congress Hotel, as in the book. And if you're wondering what the name of it was called From Here to Eternity, inspired by that building right there. Now this building was built in 1886 by George Lucas, an Irish builder from County Clare, Ireland, who built many, many buildings in Honolulu, and was built for Supreme Court Judge Richard Bickerton, and originally housed a couple of Japanese stores, and then it housed a sandwich shop, and the sandwich shop eventually became a club, and from Cafe Hubba Hubba, it became known as Club Hubba Hubba. And thanks to photography and newspapers, we know that the judge's building had strippers galore. Started off, they did, like a lot of places, they did country western hillbilly music in the 50s. That turned into go-go girls in cages in the 60s. I love the fact that a girl playing an accordion, a woman playing an accordion, is somehow part of a burlesque show. And then as time goes by, it became strippers. And there's a wonderful quote about the building having the miasma of stale beer, old cigarettes, pine sol, roach spray, and cheap perfume. This was on Hotel Street. Right next door was the Swing Club. This was the site of Spencer's, Francis Spencer's very fancy goods store before the '86 fire took out his building. Building was built by Chinese masons after that. And it went through a lot of different changes. It had a dwarf performing as Little Johnny Shaw. They had go-go girls. It even had Johnny Holmes, the famous porn star who, after getting arrested at this very club, went back to California and then subsequently starred in 600 adult films. Once again, photography and ads fill in and tell us the story. Now, the Brown Derby, there's nothing there today. Well, there's a dim sum restaurant and a little courtyard, but it was the Mint Saloon, the Lido Cafe, but in the 1950s, it became the Brown Derby, and it was the premier place for jazz in Honolulu. And Billie Holiday performed there for a week. Louis Armstrong played there. Quite a few other jazz luminaries played at the Brown Derby, and through photographs, we know where it was and what it looked like. Now this club, this is one of the more interesting clubs in Honolulu. It was on Hotel Street, right at the end of Kekaliki Street. It was called the Glade, or Glade Show Club. Now we're getting into the 60s and 70s. This was famous for female impersonators. In fact, Prince Hanalei was probably the most famous, claimed to be the world's only male exotic dancer. They passed a law in Honolulu that you had to wear, if you were a cross-dresser, you had to wear if you were a male cross-dressing as a woman, you had to wear a button that said, "I am a boy." And so, of course, they decided to make that a marketing ploy. And yeah, I'm a boy, could go to the Glade and see more, just like me. Prince Hanalei was very, very famous for his exotic act. He would put tassels on his nearly naked butt, get them swirling in opposite directions, and then set them on fire. And through the magic of photography, there it is. There's Prince Hanalei with his swirling or flaming butt tassels. Very quick, here's just a before and after photograph at the corner of Mauna Kea and Hotel. The buildings that were there before the 1900 fire. It looks like a very fancy Chinese restaurant would be my guess there at the corner. You see the steeples of the church in the background. At the bottom is the Joseph P. Mendonça building. He was a Portuguese immigrant as well. Very, very wealthy, owned a lot of land in Chinatown. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, those 7 windows kind of at the back on the top floor of the Mendonça building. That was one of the biggest gambling halls in Chinatown for many, many years. Constantly getting raided. I think they arrested 92 people there in the first raid, which is like in 1902. Here's Nuuanu Street, looking Mauka towards the mountains from Hotel. The picture at the top is probably 1882 or 3, and then the picture down below is how it looks today. And this is Smith Street at Pauahi, looking towards the mountains, you see the Kamakapili Church with a photograph there taken by Joaquin Gonçalves, who was a Portuguese photographer working in Honolulu back in the day. And then you see there's a condo on the site now. So to kind of bring it in focus into, this is Fort Street and King Street, at one point a very premier intersection. It's just outside of Chinatown, and this is what it looks like today. And this is what it looked like in 1905. And sad to say, all these beautiful buildings are now long gone. Well, anyway, I want to thank you all for sitting through this presentation on the early photographers and early photos and the history of some of these buildings of Chinatown. Chinatown's an amazing place. This photograph was taken recently at Chinese New Year. Chinese New Year in Honolulu's Chinatown is a lot like World War III. It's unbelievable. There are lion dancers. There are musicians that are just clanging and banging drums and cymbals. There's fireworks going off right and left. And there's not just this one lion dancer and one thing of fireworks. There's 5 or 6 on the same street. It's just the most awesome event. And if you do get a chance to come down to Honolulu's Chinatown on the night of Chinese New Year, you really need to come and experience it, because I can't think of any other place in America that does something as awesome as this. So if you'd like to get more information on these buildings, there are books that are available, 400 something pages for Chinatown, every building in Chinatown, 600 pages, pretty much every address in downtown Honolulu. Most of those buildings are gone, so you need to use your imagination. And then there are walking tour versions of both of those that are kind of the mini-me versions. And then all of Paul Emmert's Honolulu drawings are in Honolulu 1854. There was a set of his prints that were made that were colorized back in the day, and they recently came up for auction for about $120,000, but they were scanned, high-res scanned in color. And so every one of those scans, every one of the buildings plus a history of each buildings is in Honolulu 1854. So these are available on Amazon.com and various specialty bookshops. And I just want to thank you all for sitting through this presentation. I hope you learned some fun, interesting things, and I hope you come down to Chinatown and walk around and look around and enjoy the fact that it has survived for 150, 200 years in spite of fires, plagues, riots, sailors, brothels, you name it. It has been through a lot, and the buildings tell a lot of that story. And I look forward to seeing many of you down there in Chinatown.